Hi everyone. Thanks for joining our USA to Europe webinar. We're focusing on medical device certification from the FDA and moving it towards the EU MDR requirements. I'm Simon from Mantra Systems. As a company, we've supported hundreds of medical device manufacturers with CE marking, and a fair proportion of those have come from sort of experience with FDA marketing authorization. So in this webinar, we'll be sharing you some of the advice that we give to those clients, the pitfalls that we help them to avoid, and some actionable insights that you can take away from this webinar. With this, hopefully, it will streamline your pathway to CE certification and allow you to put your device on the market much sooner. At the end of the call, I'll also be offering out a number of free FDA to EU MDR planning workshops or sessions. So yeah, do hang around after the call as we talk about that. On the call with me now, I've got two of my colleagues, Will Bramley and Pete Vauxhall, both lead medical writers here at Mantra Systems. Between them, they've got years of clinical experience as medical doctors. And at Mantra Systems now, they primarily sort of lend their clinical expertise to our clinical evaluations, but also risk management, other parts of the technical file, regulatory strategy, more broadly as well. Will also manages our partner network, so can help with putting you in touch with other adjacent consultancies, whether it's a preclinical testing lab or a CRO and that sort of thing. If you've got any questions about the content of the webinar or anything during the call, then just drop them in the chat, and my colleague Chandani is keeping an eye on that. And then we have a Q&A session at the end, so we'll come back to any of those questions once we've got through some of the content. So before I hand over to Will, I'll just do a really quick summary of the differences between the two frameworks that we're talking about here, and that's that's FDA marketing authorization versus the EU medical device approval sort of process, and what are the main similarities and differences between those two frameworks. So there's at an administrative level, they're quite different, really. The FDA in the US is the regulator of the medical device space. So with that, they've got very well-defined approval timelines, costs, and they publish a lot of guidance that explains how you can apply the FDA regulations to your medical device. And the difference in Europe is that the EU MDR is enforced by each member state of the European Union at an enforcement level, but actually the conformity assessments and that approval process is handled by notified bodies. So they're private entities that provide the certification needed to be able to place your device on the market. And the big difference there is that you're entering into a commercial relationship with these notified bodies. And so each notified body has its own timelines and costs and quirks of the way that they work associated with them. So that's the first difference, is that when you're moving into Europe, you want to understand the different notified bodies, how they work, and which of those you want to build a long-term relationship with, because they're going to be around at the start of the certification, but for as long as your device is on the market, you're going to have to be working with that notified body. And like I said, different notified bodies work in different ways, and that includes their timelines that they work to as well. So it varies depending on device, but there are some notified bodies that can do software as a medical device certification in 6 months. And there are other notified bodies where their typical time to certification can be all the way up to 18 months. Now, it depends on the device type and the relationship that you have with them. So it's really important that before you engage a notified body, you get an idea of their typical working, and you can ask them, can you give an example of a recent device in this same device group and how that process went before you sign any contracts with them? And I mentioned timelines there as well. There was a recent survey done of all of the notified bodies performing conformity assessments, and that survey showed us that the average time from application to certification is about 18 months, so a year and a half of essentially time spent liaising with the notified body and getting your device and your QMS certificated. So that's a long time to work with before you can get your device on the market. So it's important that you take some of the learning forwards from this webinar to try and reduce that time as much as possible. Some of the other major differences between the FDA and the MDR frameworks is in the documentation. So there are some documents that are very similar across both frameworks, and there are some that are entirely new for the EU MDR. Being able to understand those similarities and differences in documentation can be really helpful in reusing documents and avoiding duplication of work. So, for example, your device description and specification of the device, your instructions for use, device labeling, and so on. These are all documents that are common to both frameworks. There's some others mainly around preclinical testing, verification and validation, and any biocompatibility stuff if it's a physical device. All of those documents can be reused across both frameworks. There are some subtle differences, and often it's a case of tweaking the references within the documents rather than a wholesale rewrite. And that's great. That can take weeks off the time preparing for an MDR submission. But there are some documents that only exist in the EU space. And so it's really important that you know about those as soon as possible, because otherwise they're going to be huge pitfalls to fall into. The most sort of unique document is the clinical evaluation, which is not really a concept that exists in the US as a standalone piece of work like a clinical evaluation. And the expectation there is that there's a literature review of the clinical field and the state of the art, and then you take that forwards when you're evaluating your own device. We'll talk, and Pete will talk a little bit more about the clinical evidence that you need to generate and present in your clinical evaluation report later on in the call. But there are a couple of other documents as well that are unique to the MDR. General safety and performance requirements, so GSPR checklist. That's a list of things that you must do if you want to comply with the EU MDR, and working through that checklist and understanding which of those apply to you and which don't is one of the first steps really of preparing for an EU MDR submission. And then a couple of other documents as well, things like declaration of conformity and post-market surveillance plans need to be written with the MDR in mind. So what we always advise our clients when they're coming to us with FDA marketing authorization is share all of the documents that you have already prepared, and we'll help you understand which of these can be tweaked to meet the requirements of the MDR, which of them can just be completely reused to avoid duplicating work, and where there are gaps, what you need to do to address those gaps. So that's always really important from a documentation point of view. And then the final difference is really on that overall approach to certifying products. In the FDA, it's broadly split by a sort of device risk classification as to whether a 510K or PMA or de novo route is appropriate, whereas and with those come different requirements, whereas in the EU it's risk classes 1, 2A, 2B, 3. Regardless of the risk class, all of the requirements still apply. The main difference is how the work will be reviewed by the notified body. So for class 1 devices, most class 1 devices don't need to be reviewed by a notified body. 2A and above, there'll be more of a forensic examination of the technical file that you've put together. So that's the main differences between the overall approach. There are lots of other similarities and differences. They're the sort of the main ones. The other aspects where there are differences is with regards to equivalence and predicate devices. And so I'll hand over to my colleague Will, who will just talk a little bit about how those two concepts match up.
Thanks, Simon. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think equivalence under the FDA and the EU is a really important topic that we wanted to drill down into a bit more detail on. Firstly, because it's a great way to get your device onto the market and reduce your pre-market costs when you're entering the EU. equivalence under both frameworks is the use of clinical data from a specific similar device which is already on the market, which supports the certification of your device. But there's some really key differences in the way that that principle is applied and evaluated under these frameworks. So just to briefly go over the FDA requirements for that, there's really two things you have to prove to the FDA in order to substantiate equivalence. The first is that the devices have the same intended use, and also that they have the same technological characteristics. Where there are differences in those characteristics, you need to be able to demonstrate that that doesn't impact the safety and the effectiveness of the device. And when we're talking about technological characteristics, it's things like a similar design, use in similar conditions, similar specifications and properties of the device, and also like principles of operation and kind of key performance measures and things like that. When it comes to the EU, there are two extra requirements. Not only do you have to prove it has the same intended use and the same technological characteristics, but also biological characteristics and clinical characteristics. Biological characteristics are things like the same materials that contact the human body must be used in both devices, a similar kind of contact and duration with the body across both devices, and also if the substances that you use in your device release substances, then those characteristics must be the same across both. Clinical characteristics relate more to how the device is actually used with patients, and that's not something you have to really consider in an FDA claim of substantive equivalence, but things like, is it used for the same clinical conditions, the same patient population, and is it going to be used by the same kind of user, whether that's a lay person or a specific healthcare worker. So ultimately, you've got to try and make sure that you're addressing all three of those areas. And wherever there are any differences, you need to be able to demonstrate a rationale for the notified body whereby those differences don't have a kind of clinically significant impact on the performance and safety of the device. If there are differences, they need to be relatively inconsequential when it comes to the clinical performance of the device. The benefits of equivalence, I mean, the main one is avoiding the need to generate clinical evidence for your own device before you actually go through that notified body process. And obviously, we all know the costs associated with performing a clinical trial, gathering clinical data can be absolutely massive. So identifying an appropriate equivalent device early and making sure that you're confident that that is going to be able to be carried through your documentation can really reduce those costs, but also time, and it can accelerate your entry into the EU market. In terms of risks of an equivalence claim, there's a few things you need to be confident in before you go down that route. The first one is that you're going to be able to gain enough or adequate access to information about the equivalent device in order to demonstrate to the notified body that it is the same technologically, biologically, and clinically. If you're not able to access the information about how the equivalent device performs or its kind of design characteristics, its specification, whether that's through direct contact with that manufacturer or information that's available kind of readily online, then you're going to struggle to prove the equivalence between them. The notified bodies, as you can imagine, will scrutinize these kind of claims quite carefully and in quite a lot of detail. So it's important to follow kind of relevant guidelines. There's an MDCG guideline on equivalence, and that can really help you make sure that you're following best practice when you're writing that documentation to try and avoid any stumbling blocks with the notified body. Something else to consider is that under the EU, you can only claim kind of benefits and make claims about your device that are supported by clinical data. And if you're using an equivalence claim, then your claims have to be supported by the data for the equivalent device. So it may be that by going down this route, you're limiting some of the claims that you would want to make about your device, whether that's clinical claims in the documentation or even marketing claims. So you need to be able to support your claims with those of the equivalent device. And then the other thing that equivalence adds towards the kind of end of the process, or should I say, once you're on the market, is that you need to gather information through post-market clinical follow-up activities, which are going to kind of fill those gaps that you've used equivalent device data to fill, and support your kind of application going forward when you come to review your clinical evaluation. So there's a lot to consider, and it's something that identifying a specific device early is a great step towards kind of being confident in your approach regulatory wise. I think not forgetting the biological and clinical characteristics and taking those into consideration, and ensuring that your plans for your post-market surveillance activities, once you've got market approval, making sure that they cover everything they need to, are two really key parts. So I think Pete's going to speak to you a little bit now about clinical data and PMCF.
Yeah, thanks, Will, and thanks earlier, Simon. Hi, everyone. So yeah, as Will said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which you'll need to use clinical evidence to demonstrate compliance with the EU MDR. I'll talk about clinical evidence with a mind to the fact that you've generated or are generating clinical evidence for your own device, but bearing in mind everything that Will's just gone through, in an equivalence claim, the clinical evidence will be that related to the equivalent device. So there are a number of ways in which medical device manufacturers or developers in the software world need to use clinical evidence to demonstrate compliance with the EU MDR, both pre-submission and following the attribution of a CE mark in post-market clinical follow-up. An overarching theme, I think, is that it's important to be aware early of where you need to generate clinical evidence and have a good proactive plan for doing so and finding evidence. It means that you have a much more streamlined journey to demonstrating compliance with the EU MDR than scrambling last minute for any evidence. The first way in which you need to use evidence for your device pre-submission is to demonstrate suitability for your intended purpose. So it may sound straightforward, but your intended purpose is one or two sentences that says, this is what our device is intended to do. You need to have clinical evidence that shows that it does what you say it does. So if you have a device that is intended to assist with the diagnosis of pneumonia, you need clinical evidence that supports, might be sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, whatever it might be. You need clinical evidence that shows our device does what we say it does. Your intended purpose is also going to be the key input to the state-of-the-art literature review that Simon mentioned earlier. It's a requirement under the EU MDR that you generate safety and performance objectives from a state-of-the-art literature review by which to compare your own device to later on in your clinical evaluation report. So in the state-of-the-art literature review, what you will do is essentially a systematic review and meta-analysis of the other devices out there that solve the same clinical problem and do it in the same way, or at least a very similar way. So if you have a hip implant, you might pull out from your state-of-the-art review that on average other hip implants improve pain post-operatively on a visual analog scale by X, and they improve range of motion by Y. The post-operative dislocation rate is Z. Those are your safety and performance objectives, quantitative objectives, that will be the objectives which your own device will need to meet when you come to the clinical evaluation report through its own clinical evidence, or in the equivalence claim through the evidence relating to the equivalent device. So you can see there, understanding your intended purpose and what that means from a clinical evidence generation point of view early is a key component. You also need evidence in the EU MDR, and this is slightly different to the FDA. You need evidence of a clinical benefit. In the FDA, we see the language of safety and effectiveness, but there isn't necessarily a requirement, particularly for lower risk devices, to tie effectiveness to a clinical benefit. in the EU MDR, you need to show clinical evidence of the benefit to patients using your device. And even in the case of Article 61 submissions, which use a route by which they don't need clinical evidence related to their own device specifically, things like incubators for embryos used in IVF, for example, because they don't come into contact with patients or interact with patients, you will still need evidence of an indirect clinical benefit. So in this case, it would be successful conception, for example. So understanding what the clinical benefit of your device's use is, again, similar to intended purpose, sounds very straightforward, but it determines the evidence that you'll need to generate. And then there's a requirement to demonstrate overall acceptability of your benefit risk profile. So clearly we need evidence or clinical evidence relating to the clinical benefits, as we just discussed, reduction in pain, improvement in range of motion, improvement in mobility. And we need clinical evidence of risk, so adverse events, side effects, risks that come through from, or risk data that's come through from complaints from users, for example. And we need to show, in the terms of risks, how severe are those risks? How frequent are they? In terms of benefits, what's the magnitude of the clinical benefit to the patient? Again, how frequent is the benefit associated with use of this device? And you can see that we can use this data to create or generate a quantitative assessment of overall benefit risk profile, and we need to show that that's favourable. It's clearly undesirable and impossible to remove all risk from use of a device, but we need to show that when risks are balanced against clinical benefit, that the benefit risk profile is in favour of using the device. And we also need to use evidence, clinical evidence, to demonstrate conformity with the general safety and performance requirements of the EU MDR, something that Simon alluded to earlier. Generally speaking, that's using the evidence in the ways that I've discussed previously. Suitability for intended purpose, that you've met quantitative objectives relating to real-world evidence of similar devices out there, that you have an acceptable benefit risk profile. So these are the ways that you need to use clinical evidence in your initial submission. Hopefully on achieving your CE mark, you'll then need to continue to be aware of the need to continue to assess clinical evidence going forward through post-market clinical follow-up. So post-market clinical follow-up really is a means by which to assess and continually evaluate the long-term safety and performance profile of your device. There's a few reasons why it makes sense that this is a requirement. One is that some risks relating to a device won't come to light until it's been used for a long period of time. Using that hip implant as an example, you don't need 10 years worth of data just to get a CE mark, but some of the risks relating to performance later on, dislocation rates, periprosthetic fracture rates, for example, those are things that come into light later on. So post-market clinical follow-up is used for long-term risk assessment. That's through continued assessment of adverse events, of device problems, of complaints from patients and users. We use that information to re-evaluate and reassess the severity and probability of risks that have previously been identified in your initial submission and your initial risk management activities. If we have said that pain associated with use of devices negligible or very low likelihood, as we've collected data going forward through post-market clinical follow-up, is that true? If it's not, we've reassessed the probability and severity. We've reincorporated that into our benefit risk profile assessment to ensure that that's still acceptable. And it's used to assess long-term performance of the device as well. Is the device continuing to perform as well as it was in a short clinical follow-up period long term. What post-clinical follow-up will also do is look to assess any adverse events or risks associated with the device that are new, that have subsequently come to light post-submission. And those will need to be reincorporated into your risk management activities and benefit risk profile assessments, as we discussed before. And it's also useful going forward to look for systemic misuse of your device. So are clinicians and laypersons using the device as it was intended? And if not, what does that mean for your benefit risk profile going forward? Really, it's important, as we said, to plan early and to understand each of the steps of using clinical evidence. So when we know our intended purpose, we know the performance and safety objectives that we need to generate through a state-of-the-art literature review. Once we know what those objectives are, we know the clinical evidence that we need to support suitability of our own device. Once we've assessed the clinical evidence relating to our own device, we can write a post-market clinical follow-up plan and conduct a survey or a study to assess continued performance and safety and look out for anything new that's come to light. So this is the general process, and hopefully that's provided a good overall description of where you need to use clinical evidence.
Thanks, Pete. That's really helpful, and thanks, Will, as well for describing the equivalence and predicate similarities and differences. Just before we move on to the questions and answers, because I know we had a few questions come in before the webinar started, just want to take a quick moment to explain how you can take advantage of that FDA to EU MDR planning workshops that we're offering. So if you're interested in a session with either me or one of our team members, just to help plot out that overall regulatory strategy moving from the FDA to the MDR framework, then you can either email me directly or there is a booking link that we'll send out afterwards as well. So you're welcome to email me or any of the other members of the team, or book a call directly through the calendar booking. But we have had a few questions come in advance of the webinar, so we'll dive into those now. I know that one of the questions was around typical costs and timelines for notified bodies, was the question. I think I touched on timelines a little bit, but I might ask Will, because you have a good relationship with a few different notified bodies as part of our partner network, what sort of costs are you seeing typically?
Yeah, I think it's one of those frustrating questions where we really have to give a range, but I'll try and be as specific as I can, really. I mean, the cost of overall for a notified body review process can be anything from 30,000 euros to up to 150,000 euros. And there's a few things that influence that. I mean, the first one is the characteristics of your device, what classification it is, what's the risk class, what do you need to prove, what are your claims? Because as those things get more complex and the risk profile gets larger, the costs go up. The notified bodies will be, operating with a higher level of scrutiny as to that. And the other thing to factor in is kind of rounds of review. So if the notified body looks at your initial technical file and they identify problems with your equivalence claim, or with the clinical data you've used, or with some of your preclinical testing, those things can mean that you have to go through subsequent rounds of review, which add additional costs. So that's really why the range is so big for those between 30,000 and 150,000. You did touch on timelines as well, Simon. You said, the expected time largely is around somewhere between 13 and 18 months for most manufacturers, or that's been their experience recently. That's certainly not to say that can't be done quicker. And there are some notified bodies where you can get any estimates of anywhere from 3 months to 9 months. And all the things I mentioned that will influence cost will also influence the time as well. And the other thing to mention is also the size of the notified body. So that's another factor that will influence it. So there are now more smaller notified bodies. The number of notified bodies has grown over the last few years. There was quite a bottleneck previously where there were a smaller number of notified bodies, and they're all very large organizations, and that meant that everyone was in the same queue to work with the same companies. Whereas now there are smaller organizations which can get you exactly the same CE mark, and they have much better timelines. And yeah, one thing I'd say is that if we're working with a client who's seeking to enter the EU market from the US, when we get started on assessing the documentation and what can be used, as you spoke about earlier, Simon, we can also take that opportunity to speak with multiple notified bodies that we already have connections with, so we can send them applications, get a feeling for their timelines and their cost, and then present a multitude of options and try and find the best notified body for the best fit. There are some notified bodies that are specialized specifically for software. There are some which have much more experience in kind of implantable devices, for example. So yeah, we always try and tailor that approach and present a number of options to clients where we can.
Yeah, brilliant. That's really helpful. Thanks, Will. There was a second question that came in around what are the common gaps that we see from manufacturers with US marketing authorization as they come into the EU MDR field, which I think is a good question. There are some really common areas that we see that aren't done as well as part of that transition. The two main ones, I think, are the clinical evaluation, because it's new. Pete's talked about that quite a bit with the clinical evidence. But the other gap that we see a lot is in the risk management. Where a very common approach to risk management in the US is an FMEA. And really what a notified body would expect is sort of a slightly different approach to that risk management. A little bit less, well, it should have the same focus on the manufacturing processes, but they also want you to have considered the risks associated with sort of normal use of the device when the device is not in failure mode, but also the sort of risks that exist with the intended user. And so our approach to risk management as a company is we use a preliminary hazards analysis as our approach, and that does complement FMEAs in some way. But yeah, big gap for me. What I'm seeing a lot is the type of risk management that's been performed, and so you can just build on the risk management process that already exists and just make sure you're expanding the scope of that, giving you the opportunity to manage those risks through the documentation, through the information that's supplied with the device, or design changes if necessary. But it's usually just changing the risk management approach a little bit. There was a third question that came in as well. I haven't got the chat up, so I don't know if there's more questions coming through the webinar, but a third question was around the differences with equivalence and predicate devices. But Will, I know that you touched on that a little bit already, and Pete, you touched on it with your clinical evidence. But Pete, is there anything else you can add on using that clinical data during a claim of equivalence?
Yeah, I suppose, yeah. I mean, Will gave a very good overview of what it means to claim equivalence, what needs to be in place in terms of the technical, biological, and clinical characteristics being the same. And Will mentioned that from a regulatory perspective, it can be quite an attractive option to claim equivalence to another device if you don't have any clinical evidence yourself. That is true. I would, however, give some warning, which is that from a marketing perspective, once you've got your CE mark and you want to sell your device, which is the ultimate long-term goal, you are then tied to that clinical evidence. So it's very difficult to claim that you're better than your competitors when you're saying you're the same as them. You're essentially tied to their safety and performance going forward. You're also then, if you don't continue to generate good post-market clinical follow-up evidence, tied to the ongoing safety of that device. So if something goes terribly wrong with one of your competitors' device and you claimed equivalence to it, unless you've got very hard evidence that that's not the case for your own device. You're running a little bit of a risk there. So it is attractive. It can be quicker if successful, but there are caveats to it long term. In any case, if you have claimed equivalence successfully and got your CE mark, you'll need to have clinical evidence relating to your own device and post-market clinical follow-up to close off that equivalence loop. It's not an option to claim equivalence forever. So those are the warnings that I would say, but if used well, it can be an attractive option.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Pete. I don't think we've got any more questions for the time being. So if anyone has any questions after the webinar, you're welcome to email either myself or any of the Mantra Systems team. We'd be happy to help where we can. Like I said, if you're interested in the FDA to EU MDR planning sessions, you're welcome to, again, reach out to any of us. We'll send out a booking link in an email follow-up after the webinar is concluded, and we'd be more than happy to help plot out that runway for EU market approval. But otherwise, probably end the call there. Thanks again to Will and to Pete for joining me, and to Chandani for your help with organisation as well. And look forward to seeing you on our webinars in the future. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Simon.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.